Your Bibles out, turn to the texts, plural, of 1st and 2nd Peter and Jude. That's going to be our 10-point of consideration this morning. Again, that's 1 Peter, 2nd Peter, and Jude. Before we get into our study, let's go ahead and bow our heads together in prayer. Heavenly Father, help us this morning in our study to be attentive and considerate to your message, to make sure that as our knowledge of whom you are and your word increases, that it impacts and matures our understanding. Give us the opportunities that we need to grow our faith and help us share our trust in you with others. And we offer this prayer in your Son's name. Amen. All right, so we're going to try our best this morning to cover all 3 books. That means we get 15 minutes as a max for each, but it's more like 12 because we got to leave a couple minutes at the end for last-minute tidbits. And in so doing, try to frame an appreciation or understanding of how these 3 books interact together. Friend of mine, Byron Nash, who some of you have met before, he's preached here at least once, maybe twice, I think, if I remember correctly, made an observation as I was going through various preparations for this class here, that it seems interesting to him that as you get to the close of the biblical canon, our New Testament text or the Christian Bible, you see a rise in the writings of the apostles and inspired participants in that message delivery, talking about false teachers. And I'm not going to say one way or the other whether that's an intentional aspect of it or a consequential, like it just happens to be kind of thing. But it is interesting to note that the message tone and tenor shifts some. Now, inside the text of Revelation, which is a cohesive book, you do see some of that. That as the time goes forward and circumstances shift and adjust, there is admonitions in context and in the situation of those texts where there is now a need to deal with those things. So it's a pretty sensible observation. And you can do with that if you will, but it's certainly worth noting. Inside these letters, particularly 2 Peter and Jude, the focus is more precise in that it is seemingly more specific in dealing with deviance or error or false teaching or a similar category, those whose character is false. We could put that as a kind of a same but different similar context. In the letters themselves, this is just an outline. There's no rationale for there being the same across left to right, but downward. This is what's kind of in each of those books. And so there are, again, once for us to kind of ponder on some similarities in their content. Here's some things that I think are important for us to pay attention to, though, when we begin to work through it. Number 1, there is a level in each of these books that is personally applicable for all of us, independent of your role. You'll note that some of them are in category groups: to the older, to the younger, to husbands, to wives. That's category groups. But each of these books have very specific instructions that we all can use. And so I think it's important for us to start there. And we'll actually start in 1 Peter and kind of just using this outline as a structure, walk through the contents a little bit of each of the letters. Starting in 1 Peter, he opens his letter by addressing it to the elect who are scattered throughout the various regions. When we thought about this text all the way back when we opened up 1 Peter, what was some of the cultural and world context that's taking place that pushes Peter to write this letter? What is happening to Christians at this time? What do we know or remember?
Being persecuted.
So fact number one, there's a specific level of persecution that's taking place. It is not completely specified as to the details, right? There's context and colorful terminology, but we know that's going on. What else? What else is some other context that would be appropriate to remember for 1 Peter? Exiles. So to some degree, there's some terminology that's saying you are now even more so unwanted. And I think it's important to note the big group of people that Jesus preaches to, that form the crowd that follows him in the first century, are from exiles. People who are not wanted in the power center of Jerusalem. These are not the priests. These are not the Levites. These are not the Sadducees and Pharisees and the ruling class. They actually get directed terms to them like, hey, what are you doing here? Who warned you to be here? So those riffraff, if you will, form the core of those early disciples. Then the tables are turned, and you have the crucifixion and resurrection, and now the kingdom is opened up. And with the destruction of Jerusalem, everyone there, to some degree or another, becomes an exile. If you think about the end of the Second Temple period, Rome has determined by that point that anyone who is unwilling to truly assimilate into Rome in the Judean area has to be pacified. And that means just crushed. And so they're all going to be flicked out of that region elsewhere. And so these Christians now, exiles to some contextual degree, are part of his audience. Anything else that we should pay attention to before we move into the content of the letter, starting in verse 3 or so? All right, so the letter then includes, in a serial manner, and it's probably at the highest towards verse 13 and through 16, a chunk of calls to change your behavior, to be holy. It's important, and I think this is valuable for our purposes, to make an equivalence here. When we think about holiness for the Israelite under the law before Christ, how would holiness be achieved? What would they need to do if you're an Israelite or you're a proselyte to Israel to be holy?
Your sacrifices, and be true to your sacrifices and your cleanliness.
Yeah, so there's a level of sacrificial giving of things, stuff, time that takes place. And Les, what do you mean by cleanliness here?
To make themselves spiritually clean, which to them they had to be physically clean to be spiritually clean for their sacrifices and to observe the things that they were supposed to keep the law.
Right, so Les is kind of keying in on a weaving together of concepts under the law that we sometimes take apart, in that there's a level of ritual clean that has to take place that goes along with their moral cleanliness, their spiritual cleanliness. Because by our perspective standard, would bathing in the Jordan River make you clean? If you've seen the Jordan River today, you'd be like, now you're dirtier, go take a second shower. But even in the time around Christ and beforehand, the Jordan River is not seen as a beautiful, pristine river. It's an agricultural river. It's excellent for doing what it does with its biology in the region and providing for growth, but it doesn't really have this super clear, sparkling water, so you're not clean in that sense. Further, their baptismal contexts weren't designed to make you physically clean in the soapy, scrubsy, no germ, no mud context, but they would make you ritually clean. If you engaged in their baptismal practice and their mitzvahs, you would end up being clean that way, and the ritual cleanliness would lend itself towards potential for spiritual cleanliness. But it's not just that. How many of the Old Testament regulations had to do with this or that type choosings? You can't have this, you can't have that. But you can have these over there. A lot of it had to do with that kind of concept. The way in which they maintained the land. What they could kill, what they couldn't kill. The shedding of blood. The way in which plants were propagated. They could take the harvest, but they're not supposed to really turn it into an orchard per se. There's a lot of regulations about that keep them ritually clean, that we would also say, they would say, this is holy. We can't do that. We shouldn't do that. Now, that's important because it creates the context for how we think about holiness. Because Christianity is born out of Judaism, and we read our Old Testaments and help that gain hope. Romans 15 verse 4 is part of our linking system that brings us the law to our consideration of why we would think about it. But we need to be careful to make sure that our application of the call to holiness does an appropriate justice to this idea of being ritually clean and morally or spiritually clean. Because in the end, understand this, baptism does both. Baptism is a ritual, right? But it's also something that interacts with our spiritual cleanliness. So ritual activity, acts of worship, are in part connected to an idea of being holy and the way in which we engage in them. That's going to come across in our day-to-day living and in our assembled worship. Here's a simple illustration of it. And we all kind of work this out in different ways. What does Jesus say about making a vow in the Gospels?
Don't make a vow unless you intend to keep it.
Right, that's our kind of application space. What's the specific wording?
Talk about where he's talking about let your yea be yea and your no be no.
Right.
Don't make a vow.
Right, if you can't make the commitment on that level, but he does it in the context of a culture, and I want you to imagine this is the visualization of the altar for the Israelites, that how they make their vow raises and lowers how much they have to keep it. Well, I made it because I was holding, I made it because I was standing near. And so one of those two vows is more binding than the other. So holy living, according to Jesus, supersedes ritual. But do we have contracts that we treat the same way in modern culture? Some contracts aren't as binding as other contracts.
Contract is a contract.
Intellectually, we think about that way. Well, here's some exceptions to that. Some contracts have built-in clauses. How many of you have rented a house before, or an apartment? I have, right? Some of us. Those rental contracts actually have clauses that allow you to exit at earlier standpoints, even if you committed to be there for a year. So you could say, well, I have to leave for a job. It's in another state. Here's my paperwork. They'll go, all right, you're good. Other times they might go, that's your paperwork. But your clause says you got to pay 2 more months or whatever. So yes, you committed to stay there for a year, but you also made a clause. And that's how we handle it in the modern context. There's not a lot of difference on the practicality of those contracts from how some people look at the Bible. They're looking for clauses. Here's the reality. The Jews weren't looking for a contract clause in this context. They were simply looking for a way to disobey their commitments and look good. And so Jesus' condemnation about moral behavior isn't a legal contract one. It's again worming its way into your heart to say, you better commit to this because you mean it. And if you don't mean it, then just don't commit to it. Because that's the better moral behavior. And that's the kind of holiness Jesus is calling to. And by the way, that's a kind of holiness that they should have been living to. And so there's a great way to illustrate these conflicts. Peter then goes on in its 1 Peter to talk about submission to authorities, which is a perennial challenge for all of us. Saying yes when someone tells you to do a thing when you'd rather not is an all people problem at all stages of life. And I think it's important to recognize that this is a mature Christian challenge. Not a, when you grow up, you'll handle this better. We are all potentially stuck in our ways. We are all potentially at conflict with those who are God placed in positions of authorities. And it's just a struggle. And the important thing to note here is that Peter isn't really focusing with all the out there's. He's focusing on the in here's in Christian contexts. In the congregations you've been part of that have not had elders. So think back into your memory banks when you were part of congregations that did not have shepherds. How many of those were kind of organized in part through the process of a business meeting? Is that pretty common? Or a congregational family meeting might be a secondary term. In those discussions, how many times were you willing to defer to those who were spiritually mature? Or did you always see yourself as being the mature one? Probably you're going to say, well, there are times when I didn't want to defer. And there were times where I just knew I was the one who had the right answer to this problem. Peter's admonition here is for all of us to realize that there's going to have to be some give and take in all your edges of relationship, especially in the context of the local church community, specifically in leadership issues. Not all people who lead have a title. And so you need to learn to defer to those who have a level of maturity or wisdom that exceeds yours in those areas, or maybe in all areas, and be okay with it, in spite of our inclination to do otherwise. Text shift on, and it makes probably the most pointed connection of 1 Peter, in that it makes a connection between the suffering of Christ and the suffering of disciples or Christians. And in seasonal senses, depending on where you live, that's going to manifest in different ways. And depending on when you live. So these Christians now are living in a time frame where internally in Peter's writings, externally in the rest of the New Testament history, persecution has flipped into a different context. Persecution has exceeded the, hey, we're going to put you out of business and run you out of town, to we're going to put you out of business and run you into the ground. And so their persecution has shifted that way. American culture tries to present itself in the sense of being enmeshed and rooted in Christianity. Was that a fair statement, that American culture tries to do that? How many of you feel like it's changing? You feel like the culture around you is changing? It's interesting, if you were to go back and read the letters written by every generation, how many of them would say the same thing?
Probably all of them.
All of them, because it's always changing. Because we have to separate between what's culture, moral, technology, governance systems. Here's the neat thing about that. You've got individuals who were framers of the U.S. government who were deists. The deism perspective has the idea that God exists but doesn't care about you. so do your best. That's the general concept of the deist. The Christian says God exists, he cares about me, and he's involved in my life. And so our governing groups live within those two spaces when they start to form the governments of most of the states and the nation as a whole. You have deists, you have those who claim to be Christians of various kinds, and so we're somewhere in the middle. But that will change, because every batch of history shows these demographics kind of scooch around. That then means that persecution is always a potential likelihood for us individually. And it can go to, hey, we're going to run you out of business and run you out of town. And even in the 21st century, globally, worldwide, it can be we're going to run you out of town and then run you in the ground. Some are still being killed because of the basis of their religious convictions, and everything in the middle. It's important to recognize that's an actual real thing. It's not a televised little event. It's not just for commercial success. And with that, then, our behavior kind of has to be in touch with that. Recognizing that suffering is inherent to discipleship means we've got to be ready and braced for it and embrace it to a degree. In the closing refrains, chapter 3 all the way through the 5th chapter to a degree, it shifts to those categorical instructions. But what's the basis that Peter appeals to for why our behavior should change? Why does Peter think our behavior towards holiness is so wildly important? Like, what big thing is he worried about? Is Peter worried about the next election? No, it's a bad pun, but he's worried about our call and election. But it still counts. It's a bad pun, but dad rules apply, and so you get to use your dad pun. So what event is Peter focused on in his letters? Obedience on behavior, but the event is the resurrection and the judgment of the earth. That's his contextual tie-in for both 1 Peter and 2 Peter. Get your life in order because this world is temporary. And whatever it is that God has planned is extraordinary. So, shifting on your books, you can turn just a page or two over. We're already kind of leaning into 2 Peter. And it begins with a sequential admonition to grow. Realize that those attributes, while laid out in a stair-step fashion, are perhaps better thought of as an intertwining rope. That you add this layer and wind it together, and thereby both of them make you stronger. It's not that you're achieving the top of a pillar or a ladder, but you're mixing these components together to strengthen the core of who you are. Doing so then gives you spiritual stability and prepares you for what becomes the center point of the last two letters of our study, how to deal with false teachers. And that's a challenge that is all the time, all people, all contexts, sorting through what do we do with their information, how about their influence, practically how not to become one. I mean, that's kind of important too in the same space. But also what do we do to deal with them? Like, actually think about this. Let me frame it this way. Over the last years of your life, however long you want to stroll back, when was the last time in the assembly of the church you're part of, somebody denied the divinity of Christ from the pulpit? Has that occurred in the preaching you've heard or teaching? All right, so we think if that's we haven't heard that, our top bar. So now let's lower the bar. What about preaching or teaching that would deny the capacity of all humankind to be saved? You ever heard someone preach that not everyone can be saved? Not would be, but can be. So we got to make sure that whatever we're going to be dealing with as our threshold here, it's one that is realistic for our context. Because I can go outside the churches I visit and worship within and preach in and find people who teach those two things, right? I can find a church that says Jesus was not divine. We would probably all go, yeah, that's false teaching, right? 100%. But what effect do I have on that church to change their behavior? Do I have a lot of leverage or little? I got to have a little leverage, maybe, if I knew somebody there. And that's about it. Most of Peter's and Jude's writings are actually about in here. So just be mindful of that when we're figuring out our threshold of what these real issues are, that we're actually dealing with the real problems. Because that boogeyman out there, they're not the one that's actually going to cause shipwreck to what's going on in here. You might go read it somewhere, you might see it somewhere in some market square context, but you can dismiss it pretty quickly, or it's not an issue. So narrowing that focus then probably requires us to adjust our boundaries and be more careful in our approach. And I use those two illustrations because they're easy. There are certainly legitimately issues I've had with preaching that's been done in the places where I've worshiped and visited. No doubt. And I've addressed it directly as what you taught was false. Help me understand how you got there. What brought you to that conclusion? And yeah, it's aggressive sometimes. But it's a great personal conversation. And sometimes it has to be public. Sometimes that's the nature of those discourses. But it's important to have that in mind because these are things in light of the day of the Lord, which Peter refers to, and then Jude certainly has as his cultural context in his letter too. All right, so I'm a little bit off schedule, but it's fine. We do have time for Jude because it's a short letter. So what do you guys think about there in 1st and 2nd Peter? That's kind of a rough overview of the content or the concepts. Is there anything that you think is important that we should be reminded of before we step into Jude for a little bit? Donna?
Everything you've talked about from way back, from God's time, Jesus' time to now, they face what we face. It's the same thing. Maybe we don't get persecuted like they did, but we get persecuted in different ways. The persecution is still there.
Yeah, I think it's really important to make that connection, that persecution of disciples is an all-the-time thing. It's easy to say, well, no one threatened your life, therefore you were not persecuted, because that's not true. The New Testament persecutions include, at times, threat to life, but not always. Sometimes it's not just you're going to die, it's we're going to make you hurt. Sometimes it was we're going to shut you down, we're going to kick you out of the town, we're going to silence you, we're going to not allow you to participate in the culture whatsoever. You can't be here, you're not one of us. The whole spectrum. So the whole spectrum is there for us too. Our challenge is to recognize it as actual persecution and then behave appropriately. Not everything that everyone does towards you, even if it's a moral issue, is persecution of you because you're a Christian. Sometimes you are treated poorly because you acted poorly, not because you were a Christian. Sometimes you are treated poorly because, like Christians, you were mistaken for another group. The early persecution of Christians took place not because they were Christians, but because they were clumped together with the Jews who were being exiled from Rome. Even though they were warned, hey, you should get out. And most of them got out. So having that grasp is really important. And then we have the text of Jude, which we've got just a few minutes to remind ourselves of at least 4 principles from it. One, Norris?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, one thing I learned that, like Peter was telling us as Christians, that word is standing firm. Because, when we were converted to the gospel, we was converted to God's word, but as time go on, we see so much change in the world, and people accept things now that they probably used to wouldn't accept. And so I think that standing firm on God's word, that, like we said here, he's talking about false teaching and stuff like that those are things that we're going to have to really stand firm on our conviction of God's word.
Yeah, it's just a matter of time before the sands of history start covering up whatever good has been done, and it gets covered up and something else builds on top of it. Here's the real kind of way to think about it. The gospel has moved across the continents, and it will continue to do so. And the cultures that were immediately present when the gospel was first preached, in some cases they're completely gone. In other cases, they have melded into everything else. And the ebb and flow of that history means that it's going to happen here too. Even if we have this idea that, it can't happen, it will. The Ottoman Empire, strong as it was, ceased being an empire. The sun never set on what empire at one point? The British Empire. How many colonies did they have? They had a bazillion at one point, and now most of them rebelled. I think the United States was like one of 77 rebellions against the British Empire in that same time frame. And so that means UK is like 0-77, if you're going to think about it in a scorecard context. So that's just how it happens. And that will happen here too at some point in the future. That then means, like Norris is pointing out, our adherence has to supersede a latch in to our culture, however great it is, and be latched in, rooted and deeply into Christ. And that then also has to be what we contend for. That makes it hard. If you go, how many of you have lived on both edges of the United States? That's easier than the other question, which is who've lived overseas. Do you know the singing is different on the different coasts? Even though we have the same songbook, same hymnals. It's different, supremely different from the diagonal. If you go all the way up to the northwest, and you go down to Baton Rouge, do you know the singing of the same song and the same meter is wildly different? It's a whole different language almost. And it can be feeling disconcerting to your faith to the point where you get upset about it. Oh, we're not singing the song right. There's a right way to sing this song. Is that an actual issue to contend for? Not at all. And if you go overseas, they often have the same hymnals. They may even be singing in English, but they do not care about the music written underneath the letters at all. That makes it incredibly disconcerting if you're expecting one thing and you get another. So with that, same thing is true with our culture. Sometimes we conflate American with Christian, or the state that I live in with Christian, or the city I live in with Christian, style of dress. Wearing of a tie. You know what happens if you wear a tie too long in the Philippines trying to go wear a tie to services? Well, if you're built like I do, you just pass out and die. Because it's super hot there. So that cultural use of a necktie for dress clothes on Sunday doesn't make much sense when it's 4 trillion degrees outside and it's super humid inside the building and you're not accustomed to it. So the choice is no tie so you can worship God. we got to make sure we're making these comparisons in a legitimate way. Because false doctrine is really what needs to be rooted out, not cultural preferences. Got a little bit more time. We can certainly go back to any one of the letters. So we have our standard 5 questions, which you get 3 books to pick from. So you got a long list. When you're thinking through the 1st and 2nd Peter letter or Jude, is there anything there that you said, I really like this, to the point where you tried to memorize the text or it changed your behavior? Because you read it and saw it and you rethought your spiritual growth. Let me challenge you this way. When you're reading your Bible, those kind of things should be happening. They should be challenging you to change. And if they do not challenge you to change, there's really one of 2 outcomes. Either you believe you've got it perfect, and I would admonish you to be careful with that attitude, or you've allowed the message to not have the sharpness that it's intended to have. The way to practically work through that is to make sure that you read carefully. Careful reading of the Scriptures is often better than a volume reading of the Scriptures. Check mark, got it done. Did my reading for the day.
You know, you say that, and you can't help on the human side, after you've read something, to say, well, yeah, but, you know, it's the yeah, but.
Yeah, and there's actually a number of instances in the text, New Testament text and the Old Testament, where that exact clause takes place and calamity follows. Awfulness occurs. Same 3 books. Do you guys have questions that didn't get answered inside the text or in our classes? Things that you wish you knew the answer to? My answer to that is always a yes. The question is the specifics kind of vary. I'm curious as to the first recipients of Jude. I want to know more about who they were. Because that's a hard letter to swallow, given the likelihood that these are first-person relationships of these individuals. Same thing would apply to 1st and 2nd Peter. But I also have to remember Peter's writing this letter, but he's also one who has been sanctioned for poor behavior by both the Lord and then later by Paul. How does it land for him to have to put his pen to the paper knowing his insecurities? Knowing his rebellion? I'd like to sit and talk to Peter a little bit about that. It's a question I want answered. Don't know if I'll ever get the answer to it, but it's my curiosity being piqued. What do these stories that are included in the context of these epistles teach us about people? Do we learn any good people lessons? Donna has already made out one. People don't change. People are the same, right? No shift there. People are, as always will be, exercising their own free will. That's the conflict within all of us, is I want to versus these levels of admonition. So we learn that that's a consistent issue generationally, from writing of text to today, from creation till today, and their motivations don't change. Inside 2 Peter, inside Jude, their motivations are self-serving. The false teachers are often identified as those who are more intent on serving what they want than what is good for the group and what is good for the kingdom. It's not a universal answer to the question key of figuring out who's who, but it's certainly a component. Do we learn anything about Jesus or God of note in here? Remember, there are two doxologies that take place here in Jude, one in Jude and one in Peter. In the Jude one that closes out, it's generic as to God as a generic concept, but we would attribute it to Jesus as well. But Peter writes one of the only single verse Christ-specific doxologies, attributing to Jesus divinity worthy of worship, which is important for us to understand. It was a major question in the Gospels. Hey, Jesus, how can you claim to be God? And it's a core issue in what creates conflict in these churches even going forward. The nature of the divinity of Jesus, to us, seems settled. To the believers of the first century, they were still fussing about it. Remember, you're going to encounter people in those first century contexts who would have seen Jesus teaching. Even his own folks around him admittedly struggled with the concept of him being more than just a man. I think it's important for us to understand, because even though we have reached a level of distance from these stories, that it's maybe easier for us to elevate Christ off the cross into a heavenly context. And we sometimes ponder at those who would have been present and say, how could they deny Jesus being the Christ? Well, it's pretty easy if you do what we tend to do, microscope down. If you ignore everything else and pay attention to one detail, you can have it be any way you want. If the only information you had was some dude died on a cross and then you saw him buried, that's your only factual information, and you saw it happen, is that guy anything special?
Probably not.
No, but the events that surround it shift the story for you. It's important to have that perspective about God, that God showed us all the stories and how everyone interacted with it. And some people did that very thing, where they microscoped down, and others backed up and saw what God was doing. For our last question, we've got 1 minute. So what else is God maybe teaching us there, Norris?
Yeah, like you were saying in Jude, for Jude to have foresight of warning them, those Christians there, to when he said he found it necessary to write exhorting them to continue to earnestly contend for the faith which was once delivered to the saints. That for him to warn them of the things that they probably facing, like we said, false teaching, that right there kind of let us know that that's something that we all should do, especially as Christians.
You would think you'd reach a point where you're not surprised by the behavior of humans. And I haven't reached that point yet, where believers I've known for a long time abandon their faith, or those who I thought would never listen to Jesus listen to the message of the gospel. Still amazed every time. That's a me problem. I think it's an everybody problem. And Jude's inspired foresight into those things is certainly powerful for all of us. That's it for our time today. Going forward, the Sunday morning class starting next Sunday, we'll be studying the history and geography of the New Testament story. You're going to be getting some handouts that have about 15 pages in them. They'll be stapled together for you to keep track of. And we're going to be doing some coloring and map work. And so you get to pretend that you're back in school and draw and color and keep track of things. The maps will be up here too, but we're going to tie together the story to the land as part of our class Sunday mornings. For those of you that have kids or grandkids in the Bible classes, they are going to be doing a lot of that on their Wednesday night class. And so you'll be prepared to interact with them on the Wednesday night classes from your studies on Sunday. So looking forward to that next year. And that's it for this morning. Thanks, everybody.